Hi. Hey. Hi. It's me. Your Void. And I did finish books in December. If you can hear a child screaming and or stomping in the background, no, there is no one being tortured. The little boy downstairs just loves to have dance parties at the moment, so... In December, I wanted to finish exactly one book, which was a lie. I wanted to finish 3 books, minimum. First one being Malice by John Gwynne, the second one being Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and the third one I don't think I ever mentioned, but that was The Monsters in Our Shadow by... pretend I know the author's name. And I managed to kind of do that. I did manage to finish all of the reads I started in 2024, with the exception of Malice by John Gwynne, but that's fine. And I did stray from my TBR, but not because I read something else, but because I read more than what I originally put on that TBR. But also I ignored the options. It's a whole kerfuffle around that. Let me just tell you what I read. How about that? So let's start with the big hitter. Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I finally finished it. It took me a whole 12 months, technically, to finish this one, but I finally finished it. And I hear you asking, why would you not just DNF if you have so much trouble getting through a book? I don't know, but I had the sense that there is something to this book that wouldn't warrant a full-blown DNF, and I was right. I was right. So I started this in January of 2024 for the Adventure-thon in that round, and I made it halfway through the book, and then I decided to soft DNF this book because it was incredibly slow. Most of the book takes place in a swamp, and that is about the speed of pacing in here. It is like trudging through a swamp, but that's on purpose. I didn't touch it since January, and then in December I picked it back up, and yeah, the speed never picked up. It stayed as slow as it was, but I did it. I finished it. So why is this story so slow and yet so good? Because this book focuses on basically the everyday life during war. The first part, we are in this tiny city and we follow Emily in her day-to-day life as like lower class nobles. So they do have to reach certain social standards, but at the same time they're not the common folk. And we are being shown what happens to a country that is just gridlocked in a war for years, and they are running out of soldiers. They started with normal soldiers who work as soldiers, then they were looking for people who were willing to join the ranks, then they had to conscript people, then they had to lower the age of conscription, then they had to expand the age of conscription, and by the point this story rolls around, women are being conscripted, and not just women, but also noble families. They have to put someone up. So Emily pulls a Mulan and says, listen, my younger sister is a socialite, she would just crumple. My older sister is keeping this family together, her husband is already at the front, and she has to somehow manage the household, and she has children. I don't have children, I don't have social obligations, I don't care about being a socialite, I go to war, so she goes to war. Then we have her being trained, which is a tiny fraction of this book, because she only gets a tiny fraction of training. The second she knows how to handle a musket, she's sent to the front line. Problem being, she's sent to the worst front line, which is the one in the swamp, which is basically like a needle thing. That's it, where if they fall, you don't need a lot of soldiers to hold it, but if they fall, the enemy has basically a free entry into the country and can like come back around and destroy the big front. It's a whole tactic thing. So she goes to the swamp, and then she meets some people, and she's a woman in a male-dominated country. So that is a problem. So there's a lot of misogyny going on that she has to deal with, and she deals with it. Everything that is put in front of her, she deals with it. And on that front is actually her brother-in-law, so they have at least some sort of being comfortable around each other and blah. and we see life at camp. That is what we see. Life at this military camp in a swamp. And they are basically taught and or told to do this kind of warfare, which is land warfare, which is what this country is known for. They usually depend on the cavalry, but you can't use it in swamp. So the way they are holding out is kind of suboptimal. And that is shown in the details. Yes, we have fights between Emily's people and the enemy, but these fights are not the focus. It's the in-between, the anticipation for the other shoe to drop, and just the slowness of war. Because usually when you read a fantasy warfare book, it's like bam, 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 and you follow a hero or a group of heroes and they have all these cool skills and they do all these cool things and blah. No. This book sits in this camp in a swamp with you, and you have to wait until something happens. You have to wait and wait and wait. This book is incredibly slow, but it does a very good job at showing you just how slow it is to be in the situation. We are never told how long she is at the front line, but for me it feels like something between 1 and 3 years, which is ridiculous. This feels like 1 to 3 years she's just sitting there in the swamp. You never get confirmation if it actually takes her that long. And the personal connections, the characters are explored in such a great way, and the personal connections forming and shifting and changing, perfectly explained. And when it comes to a fight, when there is a skirmish, the brutality is just so on point. This is a good book. If you have no problem with reading something that happens in slow motion. I was a fan, even though it took me forever to get through this, and this book single-handedly ruined my stats on Storygraph because it took me so long to finish it. But I gave it 4 stars because this book does exactly what it wants to do, and it does it really, really well. I don't give it a 4-star because I hate how slow it was. I hate it when books are so slow. But for what it is trying to be, for what it is really good. And I'm very glad that I don't have to read it anymore. The next thing I finished is an e-arc that I started for NetGalley November but didn't finish for NetGalley November, so I plowed through it in December, and that is The Monster in Our Shadows by Edward J. Cembal. That is another slow book. It very much reads like a debut novel, and it very much reads like someone has distilled depression into a fantasy dystopian book. This book makes you so sad, and there is zero hope in that book. Even when our main character Anselm has a teeny tiny moment of hope, it just feels so hopeless. This book is the definition of dark gray. Ugh. But that's not a critique, because that is exactly what this book is trying to do. Because in The Monsters in Our Shadow, the world ended when something called the Shivers hit. It is basically at some point a monster that shows up in your periphery, in your shadow, and it just stays there, and over years it creeps closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, and it basically feeds off your fear and terror of facing it, of dying to it, and at one point it just drops and it starts eating you alive. Quite literally. There is no big metaphor going on. These things basically are depression incarnate, and they basically started eating the people of the world, and once they eat their host and they are not shackled to a living body anymore, they get to roam free and start eating more people. So what the world in which Anthem lives came up with is, okay, if someone has these shadows, you don't acknowledge it, but there will come a point where you just know, okay, that this thing is going to eat me. And then someone called the Axilist is called. Either you call them yourself or they are called on you, and they basically get you somewhere safe where everything is fine. Yeah, no, they throw you out of the city and let you die. And Anthem is one of these Exilists. It is his job to pick up people who are about to be eaten by their shiver. He himself has decided, okay, I'm going to sedate them, and then I'm just yeeting them outside of the city, and then I run back into the city because they have built a giant wall for these things to stay out, and then they are eaten alive outside. That's his whole job, and as you can think yeah, he has his own shiver. He also has a daughter, so he had to give up his daughter so she would be safe from the shiver should it eventually come and get him. Now, if you think about it, all of these things, if a shiver is depression, and you live in a world where people get eaten alive one day or another, and you are the person who takes these people who have done nothing wrong in their life and you yeet them out of a city so they get eaten alive, but not everyone else gets eaten alive. So you're basically killing people. And you have to leave behind your daughter because you yourself have one of these monsters? Yeah. His shiver is already pretty close to him. On top of that, the whole population is basically addicted to this drug that is supposed to make them happy, but it's actually just numbing them. And this medication, everyone thinks this is like the one thing that can hold off a shiver for a bit longer, but now they are running out because, again, the world has ended. There is no one making these drugs anymore. They have one cow. They have one cow. Other than that, they are eating fermented cockroaches, basically. Like, they are all having nutritional issues. They have so many issues in this world. It is a really depressing place to live in. So these meds run out, and then the boss, the architect of the city, is sending Anthem out to go to a factory where the stuff was made before the world ended to find more of that stuff and bring it back to the city. So he ventures outside and he is now confronted with a world he doesn't know. Because all he knows about the world outside is, I put the shivers out there, so I'm probably going to get eaten. But the architect is not letting him into the city to see his daughter anymore if he's not doing this. So he's, of course, doing it. And then outside, he meets all of these people. There are so many different people out there he didn't think were able to live out there. There are secrets being revealed on his travels back and forth. The problem I had with this book is it very much reads like a debut novel. So there are characters that he's meeting outside of these walls that are just completely pointless. And there are a lot of these things in this story that are just doing nothing. There's literally a character in there called Alexander Chekhov. At least that's how he introduces himself. And he literally gives Anthem a gun. But this gun is not even Chekhov's gun because we're not using it anymore. So we have literally Chekhov's gun and nothing happens with that. And I think if you want to pull a joke like that, you kind of have to go with it somewhere. This never went anywhere. And there are a lot of things in this book that don't go anywhere. So I'm caught in the middle of this thing with like, okay, the idea of this with the depression being an actual monster and how to handle it, like certain secrets that come out later in the book, that part of the book is incredibly imaginative and a very cool concept, but the way it is executed is just so repetitive and senseless, but not senseless in a way of like senseless sadness of depression. You have a very great book and you have a very book. Somehow, in The Monsters in Our Shadows, it is fused together. And ultimately, it leads to nowhere. So yeah, I didn't quite know what to do with this book. I mean, we can all agree, those were not held together thoughts. Like, that is just a bunch of thoughts shoved together in a pile and then put in a closet somewhere, right? So do with that what you will. The next book I finished was an audiobook because as I've said before, in November I discovered non-fiction audiobooks for me, myself, and I. And the guy who made me realize I could listen to that shit is Stephen Fry, because I listened to Stephen Fry's Mythos, and so I continued with listening to Stephen Fry's Troy. There's not much to say about it. It is a funny presentation of what happened in the Iliad and texts connected to the Iliad and around the Iliad and whatnot. And yeah, I was thoroughly entertained, and if anyone is interested in Greek mythology and heroes and whatnot, I can only recommend listening to Stephen Fry's audiobooks. It is hilarious how this man narrates things. And then, because it was Christmas, I had the stupid idea of reading Christmas romances. One of them being Krampus Doms by Kessili Lewel? I don't know. Which is, again, one of those books that has a great concept, but the execution is just ugh. The concept is you have Krampus and he is punishing souls for a year, like during Christmas time. He's like, yeah, okay, cool, snatches someone who did a bunch of bad things, and then this person is tortured for a year, and then they are sent out into the world and left to do good. Hopefully they learn something from their torture, whatever. And as population on Earth grew and exploded, so Krampus did, and he basically split into 12 individuals with kind of one consciousness, but it's still enough separation to have like 12 people. They just have a very close connection. Makes sense. That is kind of cool. And this collective, as they call themselves, at some point said, okay, cool, we cannot do this job forever, even though we are immortal, so let's make a rule. When we all agree to settle down, we go out into the world and we find our mates, and once we have them, we then turn mortal and live our life out in happiness while the next collective is shoved into existence, I guess, and they take over. It's a cool concept, and Krampus Doms is, I think, the 3rd book in this 12-book series thing, but you can read them as standalones. I was not, like, I knew what was going on for most of the time. And the explanation of this part was great. We follow 2 characters, 2 versions of Krampus. They call themselves later on Christopher and Nicholas, shortened to Nick, because yes, we have to stick with the Christmas theme for at least like 5 seconds, because that is all the Christmas you get from this thing. And they set out to find their mate, and they stumble upon the same person at the same time, and then they decide to share. Like, okay, cool. That is about as interesting as this book gets, because the problem is when they find their mate, they have to still punish this mate for a whole year to feed, because they are feeding off of the pain. So this should be a BDSM heavy story, right? The problem is we never go into that. They distinctly make this clear to their mate. Hey, we have to punish you for the bad things in your life. That is how that's the rules. That's the rule. We have to punish you. And they specifically say, we also want you to be our mate. It is your decision ultimately next year if you want to stay with us or not. So their mate, I legitimately already forgot her name, is like, does that mean like just for a year we're doing the dirty? Like, I don't know how to feel about that. And they're like, no. We will not do anything sexually until you consent to it. And I'm like, okay, cool. That part of the novella is explained beautifully. That is normal ass storytelling as you would suspect to have it in a novella. Everything after that is told to you in passing. It is told to you in passing that at one point she figures out, hey, I actually am kind of a submissive, I actually am enjoying this pain a little more on the sexual side, and she gives consent to it. That is all told in passing to us. It's like 2 sentences. At one point they started to have this sexual punishment, and then nothing happens until one day Christopher and Nick decide, to have her biggest sin be like cleansed, we have to kind of let her leave, because just writing an apology letter isn't cutting it because of the way her psyche is arranged, so she has to go to the person and like face to face apologize. That is then told again in a beautiful storytelling way, and then they go home, and then everything is explained in passing again. We have 2 smut scenes. One of them is told completely in passive, and the other one is the most uninteresting thing I've ever read. Besides, there was another novella I read that was even drier. This month, I'm getting to that in a second. When you have a novella called Krampus Doms, and it is all about punishment, and then you just tell me that they are doing BDSM, but you don't show it to me. No. So yeah, needless to say, I wasn't the biggest fan of that one. And the other Christmas novella I picked up wasn't better, but at least I didn't have expectations for that one. The last thing I read in December was a free novella, even shorter. It's just 40-something pages, like it's not even 50 pages. It was free, so I wasn't expecting much from this. And oh boy, did this thing underdeliver! I am talking about Bent Over by the Elf by C.A. Lovheart. I don't even know what to say about this. The premise is easy. There is a Christmas decoration of an elf, and every year that thing is put on a certain shelf by this woman. And she has to do that because she told her daughter some weird magical story, so, you know, kids' imagination, the elf has to be on the shelf at Christmas. Whatever. Then it goes on with how tired she is, and I mean, yeah, you're a divorced mom over Christmas. I get it. I get that you're tired. Okay, cool. So she falls asleep, and then she has a dirty dream, and she wakes up, and turns out the dirty dream is not just a dirty dream, because there is actually just a random guy eating her out in her own living room. And instead of screaming for help, or calling the police, or I don't know, trying to kill the guy, she's just like, yeah, and goes with it. And he then just picks her up and they go to her bedroom. She's very much aware that she's awake and she doesn't know who this guy is, but she's like, yeah, whatever. So they do the dirty, and I don't know, it's the driest dirty I have ever read, and I can't help but think, the way this was written, that both of them had the fireworks twice in about 3 minutes, and half of these 3 minutes is spent getting upstairs to the bedroom. I get that you don't have a lot of room to play around with things in a 45-page one-off. I wanted to write that to have it, but no. When you write something like this, isn't your goal to write a smutty scene? Like, I think that you're gunning for that smutty scene, right? When you write something like that. Then why was this whole setup more interesting than the actual scene? Yeah. And that is legitimately all I can say about this, because it's just a 45-page free novella. Ugh. At least this one had some Christmas vibes, because Krampus storms, other than they only can access the world of mortals during Christmas time, this had nothing to do with Christmas. When bent over by the elf, we at least did some Christmas decorations, and when the little girl came home, she's like, Mom, you have to make a Christmas wish. At least the word Christmas was name dropped in that one. But yeah, that is what I read in December. I am very glad that I finally finished Guns of the Dawn, and I feel encouraged by the fact that this soft DNF was a good decision. Like, not just yeeting it out of existence. That was a good decision. So yeah, I finished all I wanted to read in December, almost all I wanted to read in December, and I go into the new year with a blank slate. I guess I will see you there. Bye! I read 5 books and this is all I have to show for it. Should put that on a t-shirt.